Hello, everyone. My name is Khaled Bendor. I'm Deputy Editor of Fathom. This is our fourth episode on those who tried. And for those who are interested in this, discussing with former and present negotiators, we had Elliot Abrams, we had Dennis Ross, we had Yair Hirschfield. And I'm very, very pleased to welcome Gidi Grinstein, a longtime colleague and friend, if I may be so bold. And Gidi, at the tender age of 30, had already been involved for many years in the 90s during the Oslo Accords, and was also the Undersecretary of the Israeli negotiating team at Camp David in July 2000. And since then, he's written profusely about different aspects of the negotiation and their structures, etc. So, Gidi, you're really a perfect person to speak to. I should add that recently Gidi brought out a book, it's called Insight, about the history and also about some thinking in the future. So Gidi, thank you for joining me. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you.
Kalev, it's really great to be here with you. And as you said, if you may be so bold, between your boldness and my boldness, I think you can be bold. So go ahead.
There we go. Okay. So Gidi, I first discovered you, in inverted commas. I was very young back then. I was doing a thesis at Leeds University on the failure of the Camp David summit. It was only 2001. And there was a debate in the New York Times, not New York Times, New York Review of Books. And on the one hand was Rob Malley and Hussein Agha. And on the other hand was Dennis Ross and someone called Gidi Grinstein. And Malley and Agha talked about the failure of Camp David being a tragedy of errors. It could have worked. There were mistakes by Israelis and by Palestinians and by Americans. And you and Dennis, on the other hand, you admitted that everyone made mistakes. But it was important for you to emphasize that the greatest factor was Arafat's inability to compromise or to make tough decisions or basically to transform himself from a revolutionary leader into a statesman. Can you reflect on your kind of experiences at the summit or even in the years beforehand that basically kind of led you to that conclusion you came to?
First of all, thank you very much for having me. And it's really a great pleasure to be on the show and also coming in the footsteps of giants, Elliot Abrams, Dennis Ross, Yair Hirschfield, who was my boss, my first boss. He taught me a lot of what I know and understand about negotiations. And specifically for your audience, Yair Hirschfield was a visionary in the whole space of track 2 and back channel negotiations. He's actually one of the only people in the world that could tell you a story where you begin with the track 2 that turns into a back channel that matures into a comprehensive agreement that is a history-making agreement. I'm talking about the Oslo Accord, began with when Yair Hirschfield met the Palestinian. They started a track 2. That was taken over by the governments. A few months later, became a back channel and eventually led to an agreement. Very few people can tell you that story. He was my boss. This is the person I learned from. So a lot of what I will share, it comes actually from standing on the shoulders of giants in this field, the field of diplomacy, back channeling, track 2, and stuff like that. So the other thing is that perspective obviously matures and evolves over time. We're 24 years after the Camp David summit, which was a pivotal moment in what I call the Camp David negotiations. You could say that the Camp David negotiations began in September 1999. These are the negotiations on the permanent status agreement between Israelis and Palestinians. They were kind of stalling until April, May, because Ehud Barak, the Prime Minister of Israel, was focused on negotiations with Syria and eventually on a unilateral withdrawal from Lebanon. But beginning in April, we got serious with the Palestinians. In July, we went for the Camp David summit. The summit did not lead to an agreement. There was another period of about 7 to 8 weeks of back channel negotiations, a lot of discrete meetings, which led to a massive moment where we came out in bilateral direct negotiations in Washington, which was during the week of the 24th, 25th of September. And sadly, during that week, while we were negotiating an agreement, we're also negotiating with the Palestinians the visit of then member of Knesset Ariel Sharon on Temple Mount, which happened on September 28th and led to the eruption of basically an Israeli-Palestinian war. During that war, we resumed negotiations after a few weeks, which led to what we call the Clinton ideas. So to me, the Camp David negotiations is the period that began September 1999, maybe as late as April 2000, and continued all the way until January 2001. And the major negotiation highlights were the Camp David summit in July and the Clinton ideas in December. Now, when we came into the Camp David summit, Ehud Barak, who was the Prime Minister of Israel, spent a long time trying to understand the character of Arafat. And his conclusion was that Arafat is a person that will only make decisions under pressure. Arafat is a person that only when faced by extreme internal and external push to make a decision, there will be ripeness to do the kind of historical concessions that are required for an agreement with Israel. So Ehud Barak tried to engineer this moment in the Camp David summit. Those of you who will take time to read about the Camp David summit, which began in July 11 and ended on July 25, you will see the first few days were actually wasted in futile exchange. But it was toward days 7 and 8. President Clinton was supposed to leave Camp David. The original summit was supposed to take just 8 days. Ehud Barak really raises the stakes, and in this incredibly orchestrated moment in the cabin of President Clinton, Barak on one side, Arafat on the other side, with significant factions within the Palestinian side who are in support of an agreement, Ehud Barak basically puts forward a proposal, a historical proposal on Jerusalem. Now, his logic was, if we solve Jerusalem, we'll be able to solve all other issues. If we don't have an agreement on Jerusalem, we won't have any agreement on final status. So effectively, Barak kind of corners Arafat into this moment of truth, where Arafat will have to say, according to this logic, yes or no. And Arafat ends up saying no. So for a lot of people that were involved in this process, our conclusion was that Arafat was not interested in a permanent status agreement. But I have to say that from the very beginning, meaning already in April, May, before we went to Camp David, I felt that the Palestinians were actually being pushed to negotiate an agreement that they could not agree to, an agreement on finality of claims and end of conflict. But it was better for us to try to seek a long-term interim agreement that is between Israel and the Palestinian state, which is why in April 2000, when the Palestinians threatened to declare their statehood unilaterally, I thought that Israel should allow them to declare, and actually once they declare a state, instead of negotiating a comprehensive agreement with the PLO, we should have negotiated a state-to-state agreement, plural, with the Palestinian Authority. So basically,
you were told to keep your smart ideas to yourself.
Exactly. Yeah, you read the book.
I did read the book. Well, you know what, Gidi, we'll get to the structure in a little bit. But I wanted to ask you. You've said before that Barak comes back from Camp David, and many Israelis then misquote him because they remember him coming back from the summit and saying, "We have no partner for peace," and that, together with the extremely violent Intifada, basically helps to decimate the Israeli left, and it kind of gets used by the right wing.
I have to say, this was the exact prediction of Professor Shlomo Ben-Ami, who was at the time the Minister of Internal Security, later became Minister of Foreign Affairs. That was his exact prediction. He said that the outcome of the Camp David will decimate the peace camp and will give the right wing the government in Israel for about 20 years. What is important, as you said, Ehud Barak said, we have realized that we don't have a partner for peace at this time. Okay?
Right. And then you think he should have then added some additional words, which is we don't have a partner for peace for a permanent status end of claims agreement at this time. So yes. Can you kind of explain a little bit the difference?
When we were looking, we meaning the Israeli delegation, We were looking at the goal of the negotiations. What kind of an agreement are we negotiating? So Barak was informed by polls, extensive polling that was going on, that showed that the Israeli public in general was willing to pay a very high price for a comprehensive agreement, meaning make historical concessions for the Palestinians in the context of a historical agreement that brings peace, but that the Israeli public was actually very hesitant and rejected the notion of another long-term interim agreement. So this is why we were looking at a comprehensive agreement. The second thing is that we realized, that realization actually came a couple of years before, that the word peace was something that we, the Israeli side, really wanted. And the moment we wanted it very badly, the Palestinians were going to extract a price for it. So the idea was that there are other layers, there are lower thresholds beneath peace that serve Israel's interests without giving the Palestinians the kind of leverage that they could have if we said that our goal is a peace agreement. And that's how the idea of end of conflict and finality of claims came into being. End of conflict, because legally speaking, the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians are defined as conflict. So end of conflict actually meant that when Israel and the Palestinians sign an agreement, a comprehensive agreement, that will be the end of the phase of conflict and the beginning of something new, something different. It could be permanent status. It could be transition to permanent status. It could be peace. It could be transition to peace. But the agreement itself only ends the conflict. It doesn't establish what is the end state of the relations between Israel and the Palestinians. The second piece is that the second goal was to reach finality of claims. What do we mean by finality of claims? It means that we expected the Palestinians to bring all their claims to the table in the negotiations. We will negotiate these claims. We will arrive at an agreement. After that agreement, the only demand between the two parties is to implement the agreement. Meaning, after we sign an agreement between the Palestinians, between us and the Palestinians can no longer bring all sorts of demands that emanate from UN General Assembly resolutions, UN Security Council resolutions, all sorts of grievances that they have. No, they had to bring everything to the table, discuss it, whatever we agree within one text, one contract. This represents finality of claims. So what I thought when we came out of Camp David, when Barak said, we don't have a partner for peace at this time, by that time I said, no, we don't have a partner for a permanent status agreement that establishes finality of claims and end of conflict at this time. We could have, according to a lot of, from many vantage points, we could have negotiated a long-term interim agreement. Arafat was ready to do it. The Egyptians wanted to back it. We knew from the intelligence that it was possible, meaning it was almost, in my view, kind of tragic what happened there, where the only agreement that Barak could go for, Arafat could not sign, and the agreement that Arafat could sign, Barak could not pursue. That is kind of the tragedy, the diplomatic and political tragedy of 2000 between Israelis and Palestinians.
So, yeah, what I found particularly fascinating in your book is you set out you've touched on this a little bit already, you set out a very clear strategy that Barak had. And I think when a lot of people talk about that era, they say Barak mishandled things. So he prioritizes Syria over the Palestinians, and he doesn't create this warm relationship with Arafat. And he strong arms Clinton into calling a summit when the sides weren't ready. But in your book, you actually detail a very strategic vision that Barak has, and note in quite a comprehensive way the steps he takes to try to achieve it. Can you explain what was in his head, what he was trying to achieve?
So what your listeners should remember is that Ehud Barak is elected at the height of the constitutional crisis of the political crisis in Israel, following the electoral reform of 1992. So the electoral reform in which we moved from voting with one ballot in Israel, proportional representation, to two ballots. So now people could vote directly for the premiership, for the top executive position, and separately for the parliament. The original logic was that this was going to consolidate the political system, but the effect was 180 degrees, was the opposite. So when Barak is elected, it's the most dismembered Knesset that we have had in many years. And he needs to bridge between three top urgent national security goals, which is yes or no agreement with Syria, unilateral withdrawal from Lebanon, and an agreement with the Palestinians, because the interim period between Israel and the Palestinians ended in May 1999. Barak comes into office in July 1999. And therefore, the situation with the Palestinians is very volatile. So he has a very ambitious foreign policy agenda, but he has a very weak parliament, very hard to work with. He barely has a coalition that he could lead. There, he has three options. He could build a national unity government with Likud. He led the Labour Party, which was then the largest opposition, the largest center-left party. But he thought that a national unity government with Likud would actually really constrain him, and he would not be able to move forward on his diplomatic agenda. Option two was to create what was then referred to as left-wing Arab coalition, meaning that the majority of the left-wing parties is preserved through a coalition with Arab parties. And Barak thought that historical agreements in which Israel and effectively the Jewish people are making historical compromises to the Palestinians, these agreements should not be legitimized by a vote of the Arab constituency in the Knesset, meaning the 61st hand that is being raised in support for an agreement needs to be what he called a Zionist hand, meaning a member of a Zionist party that supports this. Ideally, he wanted a Jewish majority, and in the best circumstances, he wanted a Zionist majority in the Knesset. But he didn't want to have a majority that depends on Arab parties, which leads him to the third approach, possible approach, which he eventually takes, that was unprecedented at the time. And that is to build a coalition that really brought together a lot of small parties from the far right to the far left. These parties could not agree substantively on anything, but they could agree on process. And he basically pledged to them that whatever agreement he reaches with the Palestinians or the Syrians, he will bring it to a referendum. So they could all sit in government while he negotiates with the Syrians and then with the Palestinians, knowing that if an agreement is reached, it will be brought to a referendum. Which means we didn't reach an agreement with Syria, let's focus on the Palestinians, which basically means that he had, for a very long period of time, for almost a year, he had a government and a coalition without an agreement, and then there needed to be kind of a meltdown moment that he moves in while having a coalition without an agreement, and he comes out with what he called clarity. What did he mean by clarity? If he has an agreement, he then loses his coalition. He goes to a referendum, and then hopefully the public supports his agreement. He believed that it would, because the directive to the negotiation team that I was the secretary of was always aligned with what the polls said that the public could digest. The other option is that he comes out of this moment of clarity, the meltdown moment, which was the Camp David summit. He comes out with knowledge that the Palestinian side is not ready for an agreement. And then we have to go for other options. So effectively, if your listeners can imagine the architecture of that tenure, for about a year, there is a coalition without an agreement. And then there is this meltdown moment. You come out with clarity, meaning hopefully he hoped an agreement, but without the coalition. Now, this is why Camp David had to happen in July, after the Knesset session disbanded. Because from July to November, there's basically no Knesset. So you cannot disband the government. So Camp David had to be in July in terms of his political planning. So yes, I think he was very, very thoughtful about this whole process. And he gave it much more thought than he gets credit for.
You spent a lot of time in the post-Camp David world thinking about thinking about and working on the architecture of negotiation. So in your book, you say that most initiatives, so Oslo, Camp David, Geneva Initiative, Olmert's ideas to Abbas, even the Trump plan, all push for kind of an all or nothing permanent agreement. And the roadmap of the Bush and Ariel Sharon era had a different architecture. Could you please just, for others, explain the main difference between these models?
Sure.
And
Basically,
kind of
the architecture
why you prefer the kind of roadmap one, and that also then links back to what you were saying about 1999 and Arafat's the threat to unilaterally declare, etc.
Okay, so basically, I'm always in favor, and I think that all breakthroughs in the Middle East happened because of graduality, because of being very realistic about the goals you're trying to achieve. This is also true about Sadat and Israel, Egypt and Israel, Sadat and Begin in 1977 leading up to 1979. Those of us that will remember the context, some of your readers may want to read the last book of Henry Kissinger on leadership. He described this very clearly. It was actually the Carter administration that was trying to push for a comprehensive Israeli-Arab agreement. But Sadat understood that there will never be a comprehensive Israeli-Arab agreement. And he wanted an Israeli-Egyptian agreement. And that's why he goes to Jerusalem, November 1977. He wanted to basically circumvent an American initiative that went for this all or nothing approach. Okay? I really believe in very realistic goals in the diplomacy of the Middle East. Fast forward, Oslo. Oslo basically outlined a process. Oslo began in a very pragmatic approach, which is in 1993, the Declaration of Principles. The parties are not ready. There's no ripeness for detailed agreements about peace, if you want to call it like that, with Israelis and Palestinians. So the agreement of Oslo, the first Oslo Accord, is actually an agreement on process about establishing a 5-year interim period during which a Palestinian Authority will come into being. The hope was that during those 5 years, the parties will move closer and closer in terms of their readiness, in terms of their ripeness to reach an agreement. And which is what happened. Oslo, the first Oslo Accord was signed September 1993. And then in May 1994, there is the Gaza-Jericho Agreement that leads to the establishment of the Palestinian Authority in July 1994. Then we have negotiations until the interim agreement of September 1995. So it's kind of a step-by-step approach. It's a very intense period, but also very kind of, every step builds on the previous step. Very kind of aligned with the characteristic of Prime Minister Rabin at the time, that was, this kind of leader. He really wanted to move gradually, consolidate every step.
And he was skeptical as well.
Yes, and of course, it reflects skepticism. Now, but then the second phase of Oslo was supposed to be kind of this all or nothing moment. We have this interim period, and then at some point, which was supposed to be May 4, 1999, we have this agreement that brings together 3 incredible endeavors. The first is resolving all of the outstanding issues between Israel and the Palestinians since 1948. This means refugees, security, Jerusalem, refugees, etc. Second, it brings into being a Palestinian state, which is, again, a uniquely complicated political effort. Just for context, with the exception of the Czech Republic and Slovakia, all other countries in Europe that were formed following the collapse of the Soviet Union involved the war. Okay, so almost always when you extract one country from another country, there is war. And the third thing is that agreement, the permanent status agreement, after resolving all the outstanding issues and bringing into being a Palestinian state, the third goal was to outline the relationships moving forward in all key areas: security, economics, movements of goods and services, and so on. 3 huge goals in one agreement, which made it, in my view, insurmountable. Really, it's almost impossible. We needed a dramatic miracle to succeed. That architecture has been the architecture of the Camp David negotiations of 1999 to 2001. It was also the architecture of the negotiations of Ehud Olmert and Abu Mazen from 2007 to 2009. Again, a comprehensive agreement resolving all outstanding issues, bringing into being a Palestinian state, and laying out the relations between Israel and that Palestinian state. and also the negotiations that Netanyahu led between 2011 and 2014 with Obama and Kerry during the Obama administration. In 2003, the Bush administration suggests what we call the Quartet Roadmap. The roadmap spoke about a different architecture in which a Palestinian state comes into being in provisional borders with provisional powers. And once that state is there, Israel and the Palestinian state basically design permanent status together. So it was, if Oslo spoke about a comprehensive agreement that leads to a Palestinian state, the roadmap spoke about a Palestinian state that leads to permanent status. If Oslo spoke about the Palestinian state coming into being in its permanent borders and permanent powers, the roadmap said, no, the Palestinian state will come into being in provisional powers and provisional borders. And then, over an extended period of time, it will shape permanent status through its relations with Israel. And I thought that the approach of the roadmap was much healthier than the approach of Oslo. And I've thought that ever since, which means that whenever there was an opportunity to bring into being a Palestinian state in provisional borders with provisional powers, etc., I always supported it ever since. Also, the one big kind of question that I would have, and I actually asked Prime Minister Olmert about it, is in 2007, when Prime Minister Olmert begins to negotiate with Abu Mazen, there's already the roadmap. And I asked him, why did you shift back to the Oslo, to the architecture of Oslo? Why didn't you go with the architecture of the roadmap? You had Abu Mazen controlling the West Bank. Hamas was controlling Gaza. The Palestinian Authority was anyhow bifurcated. It was screaming for a long-term interim agreement between Israel and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. And Kalev, you'll forgive me, but I won't share his answer. It's between us.
That's absolutely fine. So
I think one of the biggest what-if questions of the last 20 years is, what if Prime Minister Olmert would have focused on the structure of the roadmap and not gone back to the structure of Oslo?
I'm a big fan of historical what-ifs. I'll just add, as you were saying, Gidi, it's not just you who wonders, because in Elliot Abrams' book, he also wonders. He says, listen, we did step one, and now you're, again, at a certain stage, him and Condoleezza Rice have this tension. He thinks that Rice is very much pushing for the third stage, final status, and he doesn't understand why they've jumped over stage two. I guess for me, the question would then be, again, based on Barak's idea is the Israeli public is willing to sacrifice if it ends in final status. If it just ends in another long-term agreement, then the feeling could be we're giving up assets, in inverted commas, we give up territory, etc., and the conflict is still ongoing.
Alev, you're just hitting the nail over the head, which is why I thought that allowing the Palestinians to declare a statehood was so much in our interest. Because you're right, the Israeli public did not want an agreement on a long-term interim agreement. But if the Palestinians declare statehood, right, then it's a reality we have to face. It's totally different. It was kind of imposed on us. And I thought we should welcome that imposition. And by the way, I don't think that, it's not that I don't think, I know, based on the intelligence that I had access to at the time, the Palestinians had no clue about the political implications of their own declaration. It was kind of, we'll stick a finger to the Israelis. They didn't understand that, for example, there was no reflection in their understanding that if a Palestinian state is established like that, the PLO, as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, is immediately marginalized. Because now you have a Palestinian state. Second, the refugees. Now you have a Palestinian refugee in a Palestinian state. We can begin to withdraw UNRWA. Okay? So many things that we could do if they could have established themselves as a state. So, and by the way, when Israel controls the entire security perimeter, which is something that now we're fighting for, but then we had. So what I'm saying is we had, that was, I think, a very big missed opportunity.
So just last question, Gidi, just looking ahead. So we're almost a year since the horrors of October 7th, the war in Gaza, continues. There's increasingly military operations in the West Bank. 31 years since Oslo, it's 4 years since the Abraham Accords. Looking ahead, what principles do you think are useful to trying to bring this entire area into a more stable place?
Well, I think that what the government of Israel, the current government of Israel, Netanyahu's sixth government, with the far right national Tzionut Datit, the religious
Zionism, Ben Gvir,
and Jewish power, Ben Gvir and Smotrich. This is a government that is trying to defy gravity. And that's why, sadly, I believe it will fail. What do I mean by defying gravity? Today, in the area under the direct control of the state of Israel, direct and indirect control, there is 7 million Jews and 5 million non-Jews. The government of Israel, 2 million of these 5 million are Israeli Arabs, 3 million are Palestinians in the West Bank. The Israeli government speaks about extending sovereignty of Israel over the entire West Bank, meaning in one form or another, taking in 3 million Palestinians into the Israeli domain under the Israel's control. Yes, they're saying that there will be different political rights, but I just don't think that we will be able to hold on to that kind of distinction in political rights between people that are subjected to the state of Israel. Plus, a lot of them want to also extend Israeli sovereignty in Gaza, sections of Gaza. So what we're looking at is an extremely ambitious political vision that is overstretching Israel and therefore will lead to, sadly, to major setbacks. When that is the direction that Israel is going, I think that inevitably we will go back to the vision that was reflected by the Oslo process. And that is, there has to be a political separation between Jews and Arabs in the area under between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. Now, of course, there are also these huge nuances. We can't even call them nuances, like 2 million Israeli Arabs and many other things. But generally speaking, Jews and Arabs do not want to share a society. We don't want to be part of the same country. The Palestinians have their own national identity. We have our national identity, etc. And that's why this is where I think gravity is heading. I also want to highlight that the success of Zionism in moving toward establishing a Jewish state in 1948 with the recognition of the world is far from trivial. It wasn't a given. We were 1/3 of the population in mandatory Palestine. Logic should have said that the Arabs are basically in control of the whole area. Why is it that the world gave us the right to establish a Jewish state alongside an Arab state, as opposed to giving all the power to the majority of the population, which would have been an Arab state? Why is it? And the answer is because the Jewish leadership, the Zionist leadership, was pragmatic. And in 1936, the Jewish leadership accepted the principle of 2 nation states for 2 people. This is when we accepted the Peel Commission. And then consistently, until November 1947, we were for a separation of the land, 2 states for 2 people. And because we were the pragmatic side that was willing to compromise, the world eventually went with us. Fast forward, we won the war in 1948. We went from having, according to the partition plan, 52% of the land to controlling 78% of the land. In 1967, of mandatory Palestine, 78%. The remaining 22% are the West Bank and Gaza. And then comes another huge moment for Israel, which is UN Security Council Resolution 242, which effectively means that all the areas that were conquered by Israel in 1948 will stay Israeli forever. And there's only a debate between the French version and the English version of 242, where the English version says that Israel can withdraw from some of the territories in West Bank and Gaza, and the French version says that we need to withdraw from all of the territories, but both of them agree that everything that Israel acquired in 1948 will remain Israel. This was one of the greatest moments of Zionism. So what I'm saying is that eventually Fast forward came the 1978-79 peace accords with Egypt, acknowledging 242 as the cornerstone and entire diplomatic process. The annex to these agreements basically outlined Oslo. So Oslo, the Oslo Accords, are actually an attempt to implement the logic that has guided Zionism from 1936, from success to success, from strength to strength. And that's why I believe that eventually the political process will come back to the same logic. We have to divide the land, and the principles for dividing the land, my forecast, my bet, if you wish, maybe we'll meet here 6 months from now, maybe 6 years from now, I don't know. We will go back to the logic of Oslo. The logic of the Oslo Accords is the logic that will define the political separation between Jews and Arabs in the area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean.
And by the logic of Oslo, you mean two nation states in
two nation states for two people. This is the logic of the Zionist movement since 1936. And its current manifestation is the Oslo Accord.
Okay.
The Oslo process. Let me be accurate. The Oslo process, not the Oslo Accords.
Lovely. Gidi, listen, it's just such a fountain of knowledge. So thank you for sharing that. Lots to think about. And again, thank you very much for your time.
Kalev, thank you very much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be on your shows. It's not the first time that you're hosting me, and always happy to come back.
Great. Thank you, Gidi.